And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Sally Hodel with us, author of Elvis, Destined to Die Young. She's been honored with an Independent Publisher Book Award and a Pencraft Award for Best Nonfiction Book of 2021. Her latest book is called Destined to Fly, the story of pilot Ron Strauss from Iowa to Elvis, so he was Elvis's private pilot. This book was released in September. A lifelong Elvis fan, she has a journalism degree from Michigan State University and is co-owner of Character Development and Leadership, a curriculum-based business. Sally, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, George.
Both of my sisters went to Michigan State.
Is that right? I know we share Detroit roots.
Yep, it's a great old town, isn't it?
It is, but I have to tell you real quick, I've had some amazing experiences as an Elvis fan. I was recently flown to England for an Elvis festival over there to speak about the books. I'm friends with so many people who knew Elvis, and none of that impressed my brother, who still lives in the Detroit area, as much as when I told him I was going to be on your show.
How about that? That's impressive. My 93-year-old mother's listening to you right now in Detroit on her special C. Crane radio.
Incredible.
That's great. How did you get interested in Elvis Presley?
Well, I always say I'm lucky, my childhood had a soundtrack because my dad would play records all the time. He worked hard. He retired with the Wayne County Sheriff's Department. He also worked with Ford for a while, like I know your dad did.
Yep.
And on the weekends, he would play records. And he was a big Sinatra fan, so there was a lot of Frank, but there was Ray Charles and Jerry Lee Lewis from the country era, and Johnny Paycheck and Kenny Rogers. And then he had the Aloha album with Elvis. And I remember, it opened up and the earth was on there and it was just so cool. And then there was a song on there, Long Tall Sally, with my name in it. So I just remember seeing that and hearing it and thinking it was so different. So that's how I discovered 70s Elvis. I discovered 50s Elvis on my own. And really from the time I was 10 years old, I was reading Elvis books and hooked.
I remember seeing clips of the Ed Sullivan Show where Elvis, who was as green as you can be, was there with his small group singing Hound Dog and things like that. And he was just so uncomfortable as a performer. It's amazing how his evolution exploded after that.
He got so comfortable so quickly, too. You can see his nerves, and in those early TV appearances, my favorite part is always when he kind of laughs when the girls scream, like he can't believe they're, screaming either. It's like, how did this happen to me? And those are my favorite moments on those early appearances.
We're going to talk about both your books, Destined to Die Young, and also the one about his pilot. But briefly tell us about the pilot, Ron Strauss. What got you to write a book about him?
Yeah, well, Ron was the first person I met who knew Elvis, and I was working on Destined to Die Young. It kind of started as a brain candy project. As a writer and a researcher, you kind of long to write about things you're passionate about, and I was passionate about Elvis and his story, and I felt like there was more to it. There had to be a reason why he dies in the same way as his mother at a similar age. And, I decided to research that, but it really was kind of brain candy at that point. And a mutual friend knew I was working on it, and she owned a restaurant and hosted a impersonator concert a couple times a year. And Ron Strauss, who lives in Florida, actually spent his summers in northern Michigan to escape the Florida heat. So we were connected that way. And, I went to Cadillac and spent the day with him and thought it would be an hour or two. And 8 hours later, we were great friends. It just, even though there was a 40-year age difference, we had everything in common. Again, that Catholic upbringing. He grew up in Iowa, a small town. And as Elvis's pilot, he did not have anything to offer in terms of Elvis's health and what I was researching at that time. But there was still an instant connection, and it just grew from there. So we've been friends for over 4 years, and it was just kind of a logical next step. Once the first book was successful, that kind of gave me permission to do a whole lot of things with this Elvis story.
Fascinating.
And Ron's story is incredible. With and without Elvis, it's pretty remarkable.
At what age did Elvis start abusing himself?
Well, I wouldn't phrase it that way. He certainly didn't see it that way. He saw it as, as growing up as a poor kid who had no access to health care at all. I think he saw his access to health care and to the prescription medication as a result of his success. He did start taking medication, I think, as early as 1956. There's certainly testimony to that. And it was first to treat his insomnia. And it worked. When he turns to these things, it works. He then turns to dexedrine. It appears as if Elvis probably had ADHD. There's all sorts of testimony of him being fidgety and moving, and twitching all the time before he was famous from, his first girlfriend and her parents and whatnot. And then he discovers dexedrine, which again, you have to look at this through a lens of when it was prescribed. I mean, that was known as the housewife drug of the day. Up into the 70s, they thought dexedrine was, the same addiction level as caffeine. So he starts taking dexedrine, and it helps him. It calms him. He's no longer fidgeting, and he can focus better. So it kind of treats that, too. So when he first turns to medication, it does work.
Was he a depressed person, Sally?
Oh, I don't think so. I think it was very difficult to be Elvis Presley, just like it's difficult to be all of us. And, of course, he was up against a type of fame that no one had ever experienced before. And, the last couple of years were hard. As his health problems increase, it gets harder to be Elvis Presley, and I think that's depressing. He can't perform the way he wants to on stage, and, he has to rest more in between tours and things like that. So I think that all becomes a problem for him. But more often than not, he says, I love being Elvis Presley. So I think we have to mean it. We have to believe him when he says that.
I remember a clip of him singing "Are You Lonesome Tonight," and he forgot the words. And the fans, of course, supported everything he did. But he fluffed the words in a big way. I mean, what was happening to him at that point?
Well, that's the one time, that's recorded and is out there. But he did that a lot, and a lot of that was just his sense of humor. He laughs through a majority of that song, and then he laughs and says, 19 years down the drain in one song, right? So much of that was his sense of humor. But again, yes, there are times when he takes too much medication, without question, and there are times when we see that on stage.
Interesting. But what a great performer. I mean, he captured Las Vegas, didn't he?
He did, and like no one before him, and talk about work ethic. And, part of that is where the medication problem stems from, too. When he goes to Vegas, he is performing for 4 weeks, 2 shows a day, every day.
In your book, Destined to Die Young, is it a story of a person who is self-destructing?
Elvis's story is always told that way, right? And he's such a victim of sensationalism, too, but his story is always told as one of self-destruction, and I really do see it as a futile struggle to survive. And first he survives extreme poverty, and then this fame, like I said, that no one before him had really experienced that level of fame. And then he has these health issues, which have long been buried. He absolutely self-medicates at times. After, I think, 1975, it would have been impossible for him to be Elvis Presley without the medication. But what we found is that there is so much disease within his family tree, so much young death, that he most likely was, medicating his way through a lot of these ailments just to continue being Elvis Presley.
Sally's website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com, elvisauthor.com, and we're talking about a couple of her works that include Destined to Die Young, which came out last year, and one that has just come out called Destined to Fly, the story of pilot Ron Strauss from Iowa to Elvis. Elvis had his plane, he called it the Lisa Marie, didn't he?
He did. He named it after his daughter.
It's amazing. It truly is. I never saw him perform. I saw Sinatra perform, but I never saw Elvis perform. But I would have liked it. I bet he was a great performer. Was it Liberace who told him to start wearing these colorful outfits?
There was a conversation with Liberace early, in the 1950s in Vegas. One of the first times Elvis played there, they had a conversation about that. Yeah.
Truly remarkable.
Yeah.
Now
Elvis, such stage presence, right? And kind of like you could maybe compare it to Madonna later on, who keeps reinventing herself, because there's certainly a 50s Elvis, a 60s Elvis, and a 70s Elvis, and incredibly different. And, of course, his music catalog is just as diverse.
Now, his weight was like a balloon. He went up and down, but toward the end, he went way up, but then he started losing it again, didn't he?
Well, and a lot of that was bloating. He has all of these health issues that create a lot of bloating. So when you do see him on stage, even in the CBS special, which was the last, it aired after his death, and it was filmed on the last tour he did, it's his face that's bloated and his stomach. And even there's a photographer who followed him around quite a bit, and one of his background singers both said the same thing. Like, we knew if Elvis was going to have a good show or a bad show based on whether or not his hands were swollen.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, like they both said it, and neither, I interviewed them separately. They didn't know the other one said it. And that was fascinating to me because there's so much inflammation in Elvis's body. He does suffer from autoimmune disease. We know that from his autopsy, that he had something called hypogammaglobulinemia, which means that his body did not produce enough antibodies to fight infection. So, it just leads to all sorts of issues, and among the other things that he had. And a lot of his weight gain is inflammation, swelling, water retention, all of those kinds of things. And that's why you kind of see him go up and down and up and down. But if you look at those performances, it is his face, his hands, and his stomach. And the rest of him is still rather thin. His weight has been, wildly exaggerated. You'll see reports that he was over 300 pounds, and I think 250 was probably the tops he ever got to.
When he died, how much do you think he weighed?
Probably closer to the 250, but no higher.
That's still high.
Well, 6 foot man, yeah,
that's high. Who was that thin before?
He was so thin, and if you look at the 1971 performance of Elvis the way it was, I think he's almost too thin there. So he had a lot of digestive issues, a lot of, like I said, when he passed in 77, he had disease or disorder in 9 of the 11 systems of the body. Always written off as the end result of the medication problem, but at least 5 of those were present prior to fame, most likely since birth. There's testimony and evidence of that. So he really was a very ill man. His body is dealing with a lot of different conditions. Some of them are being treated, some of them aren't. And he's still, again, he's getting up there on stage, every night. He's doing these 2-week tours. There are times if he's performing on Saturday or Sunday, he's most likely doing 2 shows. It was a lot on his body.
And he was doing movies and everything else. Were the movies slowing down, though, toward the end?
Oh, yeah. He was done with the movies in the 60s. So the 70s become the touring, and that's why we see him, again, the illness increases, the weight going up and down. The touring is so hard on him, and everyone around him says that he takes more medication when he's touring than when he's not touring.
Who over-medicated him? Did the doctor over-medicate him?
The problem with Dr. Nick, who was his main doctor, but there were other doctors involved, too. There were other doctors that would approach him and have a bag of pills and want to exchange that bag of pills for concert tickets. Those doctors were the real problem. The problem with Dr. Nick, who was his main physician, is that he crossed that line between friend and physician. And when that line got blurred, everything got a little complicated with that, without question. But also without question, Dr. Nick is always trying to find out what's wrong with Elvis.
Exactly. Stay with us, Sally. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back and chat more. We will take your calls next hour with Sally Hodel as we talk about Destined to Die Young, the story of Elvis Presley. So make sure you're part of the program. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you, along with Sally Hodel, as we talk about her special book on Elvis Presley, Destined to Die Young. He was a good guy, though, Sally, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I talked to girlfriends from the 1950s and family members and, colleagues and whatnot in the 70s. And, everybody says the same thing. And, from the police officers of every city he would tour in, he would know them by name. The people on movie sets, again, from, the low on the ladder to the high on the ladder, he would know everyone by name and talk to everybody. And everybody just tells the same story about Elvis. Like, what a gentleman. And I remembered when I interviewed Barbara Hearn Smith, who was one of his girlfriends in the 1950s, and there's some famous photographs taken of the two of them at his Audubon house. And I said, was Elvis really this Southern gentleman? Like, how incredible that must have been. And she said, well, sure, but all the guys were back then, so. But Elvis definitely stayed that way. He was, his mother raised him that way. And when Gladys was interviewed once in the 1950s, she said, I'm most proud that he is a gentleman, he's a Christian, he's a good guy, and the person that we raised him to be.
He was very close with his mother, wasn't he?
He was very close with his mother. And, again, if Elvis is a victim of sensationalism, I think he's also a victim of romanticism. And that relationship is one place where that's evident. There's in the Elvis fan world, there's all those ideas where, Gladys died of a broken heart because her only son was going into the military. And, they're romanticized ideas. Gladys was actually very sick, which gives us a lot of information on how Elvis ended up being sick, because they die in a very similar way. She's 46, he's 42. Both experience a 4-year period of degenerative health, liver, heart-related issues, and it's in the family tree. And we see that from her parents. Elvis's maternal grandparents were first cousins. That was kind of the launching pad for this theory as well. That doubling of the gene pool creates a lot of issues in his maternal side of the tree, and we see that with Gladys. We see it with 3 of her brothers who die at 46, 49, 58. That's a lot of very young death in the family, and liver, heart, kidney-related issues. So when it gets to Elvis, it's just no longer a coincidence.
He died August 16th, 1977. He went to the bathroom, died of a heart attack. How was he discovered?
Yeah, he was found in the bathroom, cardiac arrhythmia, most likely hours after he had already passed. He was discovered by his girlfriend at the time, Ginger Alden. And paramedics were called. They tried to revive him, but he had already been gone for quite some time.
Oh,
it was a very quick death. Again, a drug-related death would be rather slow. They'd be in a coma. It would be a rather slow death, but it was a cardiac arrhythmia. It was a very quick death. Most likely, experts believe now, and it correlates to my research, that it was caused by something called the Valsalva maneuver, which is anything you do to strain, whether it's childbirth or whatever, it changes the blood pressure. He already has these liver, heart-related issues. He's straining in the bathroom, and that creates that cardiac arrhythmia.
And we lose him. And what a great talent. What would he have said about this book?
Well, there's been a lot of conversation about that. Would Elvis want this private information out there? It is private information. It's health issues, all of that. And he worked hard to keep them hidden for a long time, right? Because in the 1970s, he wanted to be a strong male. He wanted to be perceived that way. And people didn't talk about their health back then like they do now. There weren't, constipation commercials with yogurt and whatnot with celebrity endorsements on TV. It was something you kept very private. And he has all these people around him, and he is ultimately the head of that organization. He is the boss. So he can't appear weak. He doesn't want to appear sick. He hides a lot of this stuff from everyone around him. And now I think he'd be okay with it. I think he'd be okay with the level of understanding that this research brings because, would he rather be known as this guy who took too many pills and died in the bathroom? Or would he rather be known as this guy who was providing for over 100 people? And he was providing at the detriment of his health. And before he goes on that last tour, and people are saying, they're on the phone with him, the nights before, and he said, God, I don't feel good, I wish I could take a break. And they're like, Elvis, take a break. You don't feel good. You need to take a break. He said, too many people rely on me. I can't stop.
And Graceland is still making money, isn't it?
It is. It is. It's the second most visited house after the White House.
That's incredible. Have you been there? You been to the house?
Oh, like many times each year, whether it's for research or fun or whatever. But now I go probably I'm in Memphis at least 6 times a year, probably.
Is it a mansion?
It's not the house itself is not as big as you might think. There is a lot of square footage there. But it is a time warp, it smells like an old house. It looks like an old house. It is a time warp for sure. So even if the house might not be quite as mansion-like as you would expect, the new museum complex, which is just several years old, is a 200,000 square foot museum, and Elvis deserves that. And all the jumpsuits and the cars and just incredible memorabilia on display.
When they found him dead, did they immediately announce it? Remember that rumor, Elvis is alive, and it just permeated all over the country for years.
It did last, and I just think that speaks to how beloved he was, right? The Elvis sightings and the hopes that he was still alive. There's still, segments of the fan population today that believe he's still alive. And I think that just speaks to the impact he had, even on individuals, and for someone who was so famous in such a mass way, I always say he culturally shifted the universe. It wasn't just here in the States. I mean, he's more popular in England and places like that today even than he is here. So he had a cultural effect across the world, and yet he still has this huge impact. So, people are still going to Graceland. They're still listening to his music. They're still experiencing all of that. And some people still hope he was, wish he was alive, because I just think he had that big of an impact on the individual. And that's partly due to Elvis being so generous with his fans. He would go down to the gates and talk to people. He would invite them into Graceland. He always had a very personal, connected relationship with his fans. And I think that's one of the reasons it's still such a connected group of fans today.
Would we, or have we had a talent like him since we lost him?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's only one Elvis. When you think, he's been gone for 45 years, and he is still recognizable the world over by his first name and his image alone. Even if young people don't know the music, they know who he is, and that's remarkable. So I don't think anyone's compared to Elvis. I'm not sure anyone ever will.
No, I don't think so either. Let's move on to the other book, Destined to Fly, the story of Ron Strauss from Iowa to Elvis. And again, what got you to write the book about the pilot?
Well, Ron was the first person I met in the Elvis world, as I mentioned earlier, and it was just really clear to me from day one that he was a man of integrity. And I hadn't yet started out on my research trips to Tupelo and Memphis, and I did several of those, reviewing documentation and interviewing people and meeting lots of people. And there are so many great people in the Elvis world, don't get me wrong, but I wasn't prepared for the level of exaggeration that some people would present. People who are close to Elvis a little bit want to grow that story. So as a journalist, you have to look for that. And the thing with Ron is that I've heard him tell his stories 12 times, and they never grow and they never change. So I knew from day one that he was a man of integrity, and he's always just kind of been my anchor in the Elvis world for that reason. He's just a good guy. And it's a great story. He grows up in Iowa. He is actually kicked out of Catholic school in the 10th grade. The priest called him into the office and said, we don't think you're cut out for school. And Ron said, they were right. I liked girls and football in that order. So, he went home to his parents, and of course they were very upset. But they did sign for him to join the Air Force underage. He does that. He knows he loves airplanes. He wants to be a part of aviation. He now, at that point, believes he'll never have the education level to be a pilot. So he figures the best thing he can do is go in the Air Force, learn to work on the airplanes, and at least be around airplanes. So he starts as a mechanic, works his way up to flight engineer, serves for 12 years. He flies 3,400 hours during Vietnam. He flies cargo over and often fallen soldiers back.
Wasn't Elvis afraid of flying?
Elvis was afraid of flying, and, that's one of the reasons I think he bought such a large airplane. First of all, because he was Elvis, and he was rather indulgent in that way. And he had been borrowing airplanes, leasing them, prior to the Lisa Marie. So he had borrowed Hugh Hefner's plane, which had a disco ball in the back room and very lavish. He had borrowed the airplane of the owner of Holiday Inn, and that was a very nice airplane. So he had ideas from all of that, but when he buys what had been a Delta airliner, the Convair 880, and he has it refurbished by the same people who did Delta or Air Force One. So it's a very extravagant airplane. And part of, I think, buying such a big plane, he certainly liked the looks of it and the 4 engines and all that. But being on a bigger plane, there'd be less turbulence. That made him more comfortable. And then he hires this crew, so there's 2 pilots and a flight engineer, and they're on call 24/7, which is a huge expense to hire these professionals to always be on call. But that also eased Elvis's fear of flying, knowing he could trust these guys, knowing that it was always the same crew. But one of the very first conversations that Elvis had with Ron and Elwood, who was the other pilot, was, look, if you guys don't feel comfortable flying, tell me. Don't let anyone around here talk you into flying. If the weather's bad, if there's a mechanical problem, I can get another airplane. That's not a big deal. So you be honest with me. Because Elvis also knew that other people in the group might think, well, we got to get to the next tour spot, so we're going to take that risk. So Elvis gave that power to the pilots, and all of that made Elvis more comfortable flying.
What happened to the pilot and to the plane after Elvis died?
The plane quickly changed hands. Ron was transferred. He got a job with Evergreen Airline out of Detroit, actually, out of Detroit Metro Airport.
Yeah. And,
Evergreen is an interesting story, too, because it was a cover for the CIA for quite some time. So Ron has a lot of amazing stories that he's not allowed to share, as the other pilots who flew with him. But the airplane changed hands several times. It was part of a pyramid scheme, just really, kind of exploited in the same way Elvis was after his death. They were this church and this guy who made this oil scheme, where you tour the Lisa Marie was going to go on tour, and people would buy a ticket and go on board, and they'd get a can of this oil, and it was like this pyramid scheme, because then you'd have to go and sell the oil. Just crazy, crazy stuff. And then it was going to help the church guy buy a new church. Very much the airplane was exploited in the same way Elvis was after he died, and it's a crazy story I talk about in the book. And then after that, of course, that didn't work very well. So after that, the owner of Service Merchandise, remember that store? He had bought the airplane because his wife was a huge Elvis fan.
Ah, she wanted to be in the same plane, huh?
Yeah, well, then they got a divorce, so he didn't want the plane anymore. So then the airplane sat in Florida for quite a while. Eventually, a group of 3 investors in the early 80s go together, buy the airplane, and then return it to Graceland, and now it sits on EP Boulevard, and you can tour it as part of the Graceland tour.
Did he ever fly commercial?
Very rarely. I think the only time that I know of for sure is when he went to Washington, D.C. to meet Nixon.
And is it true that Nixon wanted him to be a CIA drug spy?
Well, that's what Elvis wanted, you know.
He did want that, didn't he?
He did. He wanted that federal narcotics badge. He believed that the drug culture was corrupting the youth. He believed the Beatles and that type of music, you know, was corrupting the youth. And Elvis wanted to help combat that. He also collected badges. I'm sure that was part of his, you know, agenda. But it's a really cool story, the way Elvis went to D.C., ends up meeting Nixon. Nixon didn't want to do it, and then they ended up having a great camaraderie, as most people do, who met Elvis. And those photos of that meeting are the most requested photos in the National Archives to this day.
Sally, what would you ask Elvis if you had a sit-down interview with him?
Oh, gosh, that's a big question.
And for you, you'd love it.
Oh, my gosh, yeah, because I just think I feel like I know the answer, and that's what my book is based on, that Elvis was a provider first. Even before the music and the art and the creativity and the music and the beat that, you know, the rhythm that drove him, I believe that Elvis saw himself as a provider, a person who pulled his family out of poverty, especially his parents, because he saw them struggle his whole life, and he felt like he was the only one who could turn the tide of that family. So he not only pulled his parents out of poverty, but all his aunts and uncles and cousins and best friends, you know. He provides for a lot of people, and I think he continues to see himself that way, and that's why when he is sick and he doesn't stop, it's because he sees himself as a provider. So that would be my question for him is, you know, what did you see yourself as first and foremost? And I'd be really curious to hear that answer.
Fascinating. It truly is. And what a great talent. He's truly missed, isn't he?
He is. And, you know, you can talk about it all day, but until you go to Memphis and you go to Graceland and you experience it, you know, I've been a lifelong Elvis fan, but I knew he had a ton of fans, but I had no idea what it was like until I became a part of it, and I'm so fortunate for that. But I've been to the candlelight vigils, and to see tens of thousands of people show up for the candlelight vigil, you know, on the anniversary of his death every year, and to see everyone holding a candle as they line the driveway of Graceland leading up to his grave, and to stand for, you know, 4 to, on big years, 12, 20 hours to pass that grave. Who else do they do that for? You know, Elvis has had a huge impact, and it continues today.
What have the young people missed by not being around when Elvis was alive?
Well, you know, if nothing else, I just hope that young people can understand how radical he was and how much he changed music, and how, like I always say, you shouldn't be allowed to vote if you can't name the first three presidents, and you probably shouldn't listen to music if you don't know Sinatra and Elvis. Because everything came after that was influenced by that, and certainly by Elvis. So I hope that young people will discover him simply because of his impact. But I always say, you know, one of my agendas is that Elvis be recognized as a historical figure. He's not just a rock and roll star. We need to appreciate him for the way he culturally shifted the universe. He changed things as radically as Henry Ford and Thomas Edison.
This hour, we'll take your calls with Sally Hodel as we talk about Destined to Die Young, the story of Elvis Presley. And welcome back to Coast. Sally Hodel with us. We're going to take your calls with Sally as well as we talk about the incredible life of Elvis Presley. Did you see the new Elvis movie that just came out?
Yeah, I did.
What'd you think?
You know, I'm not a big fan of it. It's a beautifully made film. I would just consider that film to be art, to be Hollywood, to be filmmaking. It's not necessarily history, but that's okay. You know, I think it's going to reach a lot of young Elvis fans. I think it's going to reach a new generation of potential fans. I just hope they'll, you know, delve in and do their own research beyond Austin Butler and see the real Elvis. And like you said in the very beginning, I hope they'll watch those early TV appearances, because they are just as impressive to watch in 2022 as they were to see in 1956, without question. So I hope the new film will lead people to those.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable. And what a life he did have. He's condensed it into 42 years, but he made it work, didn't he?
He did. You know, it was a huge leap. Again, Elvis was radical at the time, and it's hard to make young people, in particular, maybe to understand just how radical, especially because there's 40,000 impersonators worldwide now. So, you know, it's hard to see Elvis as unique and individual and radical as he was when there's so many, when you see Elvis everywhere these days, right? But when you look at the Billboard charts of 1956 and you see Hound Dog, and Don't Be Cruel inching up the charts. And the songs above it are Andrews Sisters, How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, and Perry Como and Tony Bennett and Sinatra and Bing Crosby. When you compare Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel to those chart toppers, you can see how radical that presence of Elvis climbing up those charts must have been in 1956, and how much it changed our culture forever.
Taylor Swift has a new album out, and I think her first 10 songs are number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for Billboard. That's incredible, too.
It is remarkable.
Let's go to the phones. Let's go to Laura in Missouri to get us started, east of the Rockies. Hi, Laura. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call.
Our pleasure.
I have a friend, very good friend of mine, who inherited all the contents of her mother-in-law's house. Her mother-in-law was a war bride from Wiesbaden, Germany, who married an American soldier, and he was, I believe, an army photographer. In an old trunk, she found photos and negatives of Elvis in the military, along with 2 manuscripts that the husband had written in both English and German. And there's so much heightened awareness right now about Elvis. She'd really like to get this out somewhere and find a publisher, but we don't know where to go or how to go about this.
What do you recommend, Sal?
Yeah, I don't know if a publisher is the right person or a person who's an expert in the memorabilia. There's a lot of people who would like to own stuff like that, obviously. The manuscripts sound really interesting. If you email me, and my email address I think is up on that website, Sally@elvisauthor.com, I can definitely connect you with the right people just to give you the value of what that would be.
All right,
incredible things.
Do that, Laura, and the website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com to be sure. Next up, let's go to Walter in Pennsylvania. Hey, Walt, are you an Elvis fan?
Yeah, more or less, George. He was a great one. Why, George, one of the curious things I noticed when I first viewed you can see it on the internet. I think they call it the Garden of Remembrance, where Elvis is buried in Graceland with his parents. And I noticed the curious thing that his mother was 4 years older than his father. According to the grave markers, his mother was born in 1912, his father in 1916, which George, his father was just 18 years old when he was born in January of 1935.
Wow.
So it's just a curious thing that I've never, heard discussed about Elvis.
Yeah, and both of them actually, they ran away to get married in a nearby town, and they lied about their ages on the marriage certificate. So Gladys pretended to be younger, and Vernon pretended to be older. There's a statement in my book that says something like he wasn't yet seen as old enough to be married in the eyes of the state of Mississippi, but they agree, they decided to get married, and they kind of eloped one night. They couldn't afford the $3 for the marriage license. They had to borrow that from friends, and they fibbed about their age.
That's amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing, and it lends itself to another thing that happened immediately after Elvis died. One of the stories that the Washington Post printed was that Elvis and his mother died at the same age, and they said Gladys died at 42, Elvis was 42. Of course, that's completely false. Gladys was 46 when she died, but it was kind of the beginnings of that, romanticism of that relationship, or that idea that they would die at the same age and in the same way. But it also lends itself to the fact that Gladys lied about her age for a long time because she did not like being older than her husband.
Sally, how distraught was Elvis when his mother died?
Very. They were very close. They were very close. Without question, he grieved. But there is also a tremendous amount of evidence that he grieved in a normal way. Again, there is a lot of, fan base maybe that wants to think he was destroyed, that he couldn't live without his mother, but that's clearly not true, because he went on and lived for 20 years, and he became a father and a husband. He had a decade of making successful films, and then he had a decade of touring in a way that no one had toured before, and took over Vegas, like you mentioned earlier. So the loss of his mother in no way stopped his life, and there's a great interview, I believe it's from 1962 on YouTube, where he talks about how these things happen. We experience good things in life and bad things in life, and bad things like my mother passing, and I wish she could have seen more of my success, but I'm so thankful she saw what she did see. And, he buys the Audubon house for her. He buys Graceland for her. He wants to give her the comforts because he saw her and his father. Vernon doesn't get the credit either, but he saw his parents always struggling and never making ends meet.
What is the daughter, Lisa Marie, doing now?
She's done a lot of things. She's recorded. I know, and now for the last 2 years, she's been grieving the loss of her son, who tragically ended his life a couple of years ago. So I think that's been her main focus, is taking care of her young daughters and that natural grieving process. And
Priscilla's still around, isn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. And she's a big part of promoting Elvis's legacy. And she's always at Graceland, for birthday and Elvis Week and all those kinds of things.
Let's go to Dan in Oklahoma City. Welcome to the show. Hey, Dan.
Hey, George. Oh, good show.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. I've been a lifelong fan of Elvis. And, just a comment and then a quick question.
Sure.
I think millions of people around the world loved him because he, not just his music, but he understood the value of humility. That's one of the things that I always appreciated about him, despite his enormous career. But and we've had a chance to visit his not only Graceland, but I really like the at one time you could go down to Tupelo, Mississippi, where he was born. They're right off Veterans Boulevard, and for $1 you could walk through the house, where he was born, a little shotgun house, which is just down the hill from the museum. And I'll never forget, I went into that gift shop and bought a pair of Elvis glasses, the large rim, gold rims with the really dark shades. And one of the question I had is, I think a lot of us wanted to really believe that maybe he did fake his death. I don't really think he did, but there was a lady, I think her name was Gail Brewer from Georgia, that wrote a book years ago about that possibility, like they didn't cash in his, life insurance after the death, that he flew to Hawaii. And I mean, kind of like, the rumors about Howard Hughes, I think one of your hosts on the weekend had a show on that not long ago about that possibility.
Mm-hmm.
He was just trying to get away from all the limelight, and but I would just be curious to see what your guest, even if it was just 10 or 20 years, if he lived another 10 or, because Geraldo, and I think, was it Larry King? Didn't they do a program on that possibility?
Yeah, they did. Everybody did. I interviewed several book authors who've written books about the possibility too. Is it possibly, Sally, because people just don't want their fans or celebrities to die?
I think that's part of it, and I think Elvis, again, offered himself up in a way through his humility, like the caller said, that made people feel like they knew him. I always say that the tough thing about Elvis is that every fan feels like they own him or know him in their own way, and that's complicated when it comes to, again, wanting him to be viewed as a historical figure, wanting the truth and the facts to get through, but at the same time, it's a beautiful thing that Elvis was able to reach people in such a mass way, but also on such an individual level. And I think that's part of his brilliance, right? And that is part of why he's still talked about all these years later, 4.5 decades after his death, is because he reached people in an individual way. I think Elvis absolutely died on August 16th, 1977. I don't believe there's any doubt in that. I think a lot of these ideas come out, or people want to cling to them because they are in book form. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is claiming, intellectual integrity for Elvis and making sure that we're reading well-documented, well-sourced information. Because if a new book came out on George Washington and it said, never before heard information on George Washington,
right,
and there was not a single citation in the back of the book, no one would believe it. But if a book comes out on Elvis Presley and they say, never before known, information on Elvis Presley, and there could be not a single page of citation in the back, and people will believe it as if it's complete fact. And there are a ton of books out there. There are books by people who claim to have hours-long phone calls with him the last 2 weeks of his life. There are books out there that claim they were receiving letters for years from Elvis, and that's what the book is based on. None of it is true. And I would just really encourage people to read books that are fully cited, fully researched. And I'm not saying just read my book, but there are 32 pages of citation in the back of the book. And the reason I went to that extra step in not only the lengths to make sure all of my research was documented, but the cost of printing 32 more pages was because Elvis is rarely given that level of journalistic integrity. And that was so important to me.
Indeed. Did he not eventually get along with the Beatles?
Yeah, absolutely. There's great stories about how he met the Beatles at his California house, and Paul
He wanted to jam with him, didn't he?
Yeah, Paul wanted to jam, and there's a great story about how they sat down and no one was really talking because everybody was a little uncomfortable, because it's the Beatles and it's Elvis and just the greatest people on the planet at that time. They don't really know how to relate to each other. And Elvis had a TV with a remote control, and he was one of the first people to have that. And when Elvis turned on the TV and started changing the channels from the couch, Paul McCartney said, "My God, he really is the king. He can change the channel from the couch." And he was just flabbergasted because he'd never seen a remote control before.
He didn't know what that was like.
1960s.
Elvis should have hit it and did it like mind control.
Right. That would have been awesome.
Let's go to Dan, truck driving in Texas. Hey, Dan, go ahead.
Hey, how you doing?
Wonderful.
Back in '77, I was living in Omaha, driving a cab, and it was Elvis's Next to the Last concert. The one after that was Indianapolis. But I remember so well the hype that was built up and the amount of tips I got from I have never made that much money driving a cab in my life except for that night. And I just wanted to share that. That town went nuts over this guy, and I don't blame him.
That's
not all I got to say.
Thank you, Dana. Sally, why was he so electrifying?
That's incredible, and I just want to add to his statement, that that is one of the trips that is highlighted in the Ron Strauss book because his family was from Iowa, and Omaha was nearby, so his family members were at the airport and all of that. But interviewing fans, they talked about how that airplane would come into town, and they knew Elvis was in town. So that airplane with the TCB taking care of business and the lightning bolt on the tail, it really became synonymous with Elvis being in town, just like the pink Cadillac in 1956 was. If that was in the driveway, everybody knew Elvis was in town. So that's really interesting to hear that he felt that electricity as a cab driver. That's really cool.
Next up, we've got Mary in the state of New Jersey. Hi, Mary. Go ahead.
Hello, George. Hello, Sally. I have a question. Inspiration for Jailhouse Rock. Do you know if he ever sang for the prisoners? He ever went into jail or
like Johnny Cash did? Did he ever do that, Sally?
Did he ever put on a show?
As far as I know, that was all a Hollywood set, and he was instrumental in the choreography of that dance. They initially wanted him to do some things that he didn't feel comfortable doing. Elvis never thought of himself as a dancer, which I think is fascinating since he's still, his moves, those early moves of the 50s are so iconic. But he did end up working with the choreographer and changing things so that the whole routine was a little more Elvis-like.
Remember the classic with him singing with Frank Sinatra?
Love it.
I mean, and even Frank didn't like him in the beginning and ended up loving the guy.
Absolutely. And, Frank was right. He was worried that music was going to chip away at his base, and what he was doing. But then again, when they met, again, Frank recognized Elvis as a decent man, like we talked about in the very beginning of the interview. And of course, Frank was decent as well. And, the two people who I consider to be the two greatest entertainers of all time, Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley, the fact that we have video of them performing on stage together is remarkable because that never had to happen. That's something we could go without, and I'm just so glad it happened.
In Frank's early career, he had the young Bobby Sock women who loved him, but as he got older, they matured, he matured. Elvis came along, and Frank, I guess, forgot that he had matured to the point where he had a different crowd, Frank did, and he didn't have to worry about Elvis's younger crowd anymore.
Absolutely. And Frank still had the guys at that point. My dad was born in 1935, just like Elvis, and graduated from high school in 54, and he was not an Elvis fan. Like, how could you not be an Elvis fan? And he said, I was a Sinatra fan, and Elvis in the 50s was for the girls. The boys did not like Elvis. It was the girls who were gaga. He was, just that teenage girl phenomenon. So when Elvis goes into the military, there really is that shift in his career. When he comes back, not only that he served, did he gain a lot of respect from the men in the country and grow the fan base that way. But then again, perfect to be on Frank Sinatra's TV show and appear as Frank Sinatra because that brings the fan base together and grows it. But he just had a lot more respect. I think he was much more mature, and the male audience understood that, and it grew his audience without question. There was a lot more respect for Elvis after that. But in the very beginning, even Ron Strauss, Ron Strauss's pilot tells a great story of one of the first times, they were talking, and Elvis said, we're about the same age, Ron. What did you think about me when I was first coming up? And Ron said, well, to be honest, Elvis, I hated your ass because...
I can't say that. Can't say that.
Oh, sorry. I hated do. And, Elvis was, taken aback by it, but appreciated the honesty. He's like, do you care to explain? And Ron said, well, I was taking out all these beautiful young ladies, and all they wanted to do was talk about you.
The guys got jealous, I guess.
Yeah, the guys were definitely jealous. So, then Elvis said, well, what do you think about me now, Ron? And Ron's like, well, of course I love you now. He's his boss, and of course he's not dumb. But Elvis was really for the girls in the very beginning.
Louise in Kentucky, first-time caller. Hi, Louise.
Yes, been trying to reach you forever. I listen to you every night.
Well, thank you.
And I happen to get through. Thank you, your guest. I wanted to ask, and it may have been already asked, did he have a twin?
Did Elvis had a twin that died at birth? Did he not, Sally?
Elvis had a twin. He died at birth. He was born first. Jesse Guerin was born first. We'll never know if it was due to the genetic issues or not, but he was stillborn. He was perfectly formed, looked healthy and normal, and then Elvis was born second. They were so poor at the time, just to capture their level of poverty. Little Jesse Guerin was put in a cardboard box on the kitchen table, and then he was buried in that box.
Oh, my gosh.
In an unmarked grave. So,
do we know if it was an identical twin or a fraternal twin?
We do not know. We do not know. So much lost to history with that.
Yeah. Would the parents have known? I guess they would have, right? Can you tell with a baby that young?
It would be very difficult to tell. And I think Vernon is on record saying that they were not identical, if I'm remembering correctly. But again, I think anything would have been a guess at that point. For twins, as little as they must have been, both Gladys and Elvis, the babies were born at home. The doctor was called, and Gladys had lost a lot of blood. Elvis had some struggles. They were sent to the hospital, which is very unusual. In 1935, they could not pay the hospital bill. It was covered, by welfare. And they were in the hospital for 3 weeks because of Elvis's low birth weight, and Gladys had lost a lot of weight. So the babies were very tiny. I think it would have been very hard to tell whether they were identical or not.
Sally, where do we get your books?
ElvisAuthor.com is a great place to start. It gives you a lot more information, and of course, they're on Amazon as well.
All right, we're going to come back in just a moment with Sally Hodel and take final phone calls as we talk about her incredible research into the life of Elvis Presley with the book called Destined to Die Young. And then she's got Destined to Fly that just came out, the story of pilot Ron Strauss from Iowa to Elvis. Next hour, we start open lines here on Coast to Coast, and when we come back, we'll take final calls with Sally Hodel as we talk about the life of Elvis Presley with her book, Destined to Die Young. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie back with Sally Hodel, and we'll take final calls with Sally. Sally, what did you know about Colonel Tom Parker? What did you think of him?
Well, interestingly, exploring this layer of information with Elvis's health, it kind of gave me, a little bit of peace with other aspects of Elvis's life. One being the provider and his relationship and experience with poverty, but the other, his relationship with the Colonel. I came to a point where I understood that in a way that I hadn't before. And I think that in the 1956, they made an agreement. I will handle the singing, you will handle the money. And I think that worked for a long time. But there was that separation of responsibilities. And I do think that the Colonel is overly demonized in the movie. But at the same time, I also believe that Elvis should have had more than one manager. There is a time when the Colonel no longer is the best thing or the best person for him, and that's clear because Elvis does move beyond being just that provider, and he becomes this creative, artistic force, and that was not a good match with the Colonel, who was the money guy. So pros and cons, it's not a simple relationship at all. It's not a simple explanation, and you can't say it's all good or all bad. It's absolutely both.
They spent a lot of time in Las Vegas. Did the Colonel have a gambling problem?
Absolutely. And, Ron Strauss talks about it. He says he saw the Colonel with a stack of chips and that, Elvis talked about it too. He said he felt like he was playing there just to pay off the Colonel's debt. So a lot of relationships in Elvis's professional world, they become enmeshed, and that is certainly one of them.
Let's go back to the call. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sally.
No, I was just going to add that at the same time, the Colonel, it's a difficult thing to analyze because the Colonel is kind of that roadblock in front of Elvis so that Elvis doesn't have to deal with a lot of things that he doesn't want to deal with. And it does ensure him a little bit of privacy, even through his extreme fame. So the Colonel's a bad guy for that reason, too. It's a complicated thing. And
Elvis felt loyal to the Colonel, though, didn't he?
Elvis felt loyalty to everyone who helped him get where he was, without question.
Yep, he remembers the beginning.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Let's go to the phones. Robert in Arizona to get us started here. Go ahead, Robert.
Hey, I was a young police officer in about 1970 in Palm Springs, California, and I had a couple of experiences with Elvis. Very positive. He's a pretty nice guy. I met him once at his home. He had a standing invitation for any of the guys who are out on duty and at night, and if the porch light was on, he could stop in and have coffee. Just down home, Southern hospitality kind of thing. And if he was there, he'd sit down on the couch and talk to you, which I had the opportunity to do that with him one time.
Oh, cool!
And it was a really a great experience. He even showed me pictures that he had made out of his own little album of Graceland. And, of course, I told him that my relatives are all from Tennessee, too, so we talked about that for a while. Second time I had a contact with him it was a slow Sunday night, and I was running to an accident on the outskirts of town. One car rolled over, running about 110 miles an hour, and I saw these headlights right behind me. And when I got there and pulled around and stopped, it was Elvis in his Stutz Bearcat. And he didn't have a security with him. He'd snuck out of the house, I guess. He jumps out of the car, and he's got his big Cop 5-cell flashlight, and he's saying, "Hey, Bob, what can I do? Can I help you? What's going on here?" So I got some flares out of the trunk, and I showed him how to light one, and I said, "Just lay these flares out here and direct the traffic down this one lane." So here is Elvis Presley standing out there on the highway directing traffic around this accident. And I was wondering, if people would have known that was Elvis Presley standing out there, probably would have had another accident. But at the time, it seemed like a pretty cool thing to do. So he was really a nice guy. He loved cops. And as a matter of fact, my sergeant, Dick Grove, I think you've heard of him before, he went to work for him as his chief of security. And he wrote a book called the Elvis Conspiracy. So anyway, that was my experience with Elvis, and he was a neat guy, and everybody missed him a lot when he passed.
Great story. How did he know about the accident? Did he have a police scanner at home?
Yeah, they used to ride around, him and his guys used to ride around in this great, they had this big Mercedes Grosser, big limousine 600 Grosser, and they had a scanner, and they'd show up on calls all the time, when they had nothing to do. They'd just cruise around at night, and they had the sunroof, and they'd be standing up out of the sunroof and looking, watching what you were doing and talking, and they just had a ball. That's what they loved to do.
I love that.
That's what he loved to do anyway. I think he would have, if he wasn't a singer and what happened, maybe he would have turned out to be a cop. I don't know.
What did you think when you heard that he had died, Robert?
Well, I figured that Dick, who worked for him, Dick Grove, first thing I thought, well, Dick's out of a job now.
Yeah.
And I was very, I was just sort of shocked, probably like everybody else was, and just couldn't believe it. He was just seemed to be so young and viral that I thought he just can't be gone at this age. But he, he was a third-degree black belt karate.
Right.
He could take care of himself, and he always had at least 3 or 4 guns on him and knives and everything else. And they would get in karate fights at this house up there they had in Palm Springs and bust up all the furniture. And the next morning there'd be a truck there with brand new furniture hauling off. That was it.
Bring it in, bring it out. Thanks, Robert. Great stories. Sally, these are unbelievable, aren't they?
Absolutely. And, Elvis had tremendous respect for law enforcement. And from day one, in the 50s, the police in every little town, would save him from the girls rushing the stage or, there's pictures and stories of them literally ripping his clothes off, and the police would get him out of there. And he knew the police by their names in every town he went to. That never changed. He did talk about wanting to be a police officer if he hadn't been a singer. He just wanted to provide for his family. He talked about maybe being an electrician, maybe being a police officer. There's a long legacy in Mississippi of police service, in his family. Larry Presley is a direct descendant, and he was a police officer, and many of his relatives. So he had tremendous respect, and he did have a police light, and he would drive around the Memphis area, and he would pull people over. And then he would just warn them and ask them to slow down. And at one point, both Sam Thompson and Dick Grove tell these stories, because Sam Thompson had been with the police department. He's like, well, Elvis wants a police light, and then Elvis wants a ticket writing book. And they're like, well, we can't give him a ticket writing book. And some people think that's really bizarre, but, I really think it was, when you talk about Elvis's humility and how he saw himself as a regular person, I think that was maybe Elvis's way of thinking, like, what would have happened to me if I hadn't been Elvis Presley? I would have been a police officer, and this is one way I can connect with regular people, and he had fun with it. He just did. He loved it, and he had great respect for law enforcement.
He would have been going nuts today, Sally, with this talk of defunding police departments.
He would have been heartsick over it, without question.
When he went away to the military, that was a 2-year term, wasn't it?
It was.
When he came back, was he just as popular than when he left, or even more so?
More so, and in a different way. We spoke to that earlier, where he kind of became, one of the journalists of the day wrote that he kind of became like Clark Gable. He had that thing that women loved and that thing that men wanted to aspire to. And, after the military stint, he lost that teeny bopper image. His voice matured. We know that. He worked with Charlie Hodge, who had actually had musical training the whole time he was in Germany. So he comes back, and his voice, he realized what his voice was capable of during that time. And, of course, he lost his mother right before going in the Army. So I think that time to just be Elvis after the incredible amount of fame that he experienced, 56 to 58, some people think, well, maybe that was bad for him, but I think it was a good thing for Elvis. I think it let him slow down for a minute, and it let him go back to be as normal of a regular person as he would ever have the opportunity to be.
And help mature him.
Absolutely. And it gave him time to grieve his mother, too, without the constant touring or fame, whatever what he would have been doing if he had stayed here. And I just think it let him be like everybody else for a little while, with all the guys who wore the same uniforms and pulled the same maneuvers and did the same tactical things they did in the Army. Let's
go to David in Wisconsin. David, it's your turn, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, George. This is the second time I talked to you. I talked to you a few months ago. I told you that Ed Gein story about the lady.
Oh, yeah. Great story.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I actually got to see Elvis Presley twice in concert here in Madison, Wisconsin. The first time was October 19th of 76, and the second time was June 24th of 77. And October 19th of 76, Elvis was, still really good looking and didn't have that belly on him or anything.
Yeah.
So all that weight and stuff that Elvis gained was just in the last few months of his life, between like that October and that June. But anyway, when Elvis appeared in Madison on June 24th, he was flying in from Des Moines, Iowa, and he was at the airport, and he was in his limousine, and they were traveling from the airport to the Sheraton Hotel, and they were at the intersection of 151 and East Washington Avenue. And Elvis looked to his right, and he saw a scuffle going on in the gas station. And Elvis told his driver to stop, and Elvis jumps out of the car. The sheriff of Dane County was sitting with Elvis, but the sheriff sat in the car. But Elvis jumps out of the car, runs into the gas station. There was two guys scuffling with this one gas station attendant, and Elvis told those guys that were roughing up the gas station attendant, like, if you guys want to fight, let's go. And everything just froze. Everybody just dropped, and then the police came, and then and everything just froze. And today, like, if you go to this intersection, the gas station is gone now. But if you go to that intersection, there's a little monument there about the size of a small tombstone, really.
Yeah, uh-huh.
But there's a monument there that mentions about this, how Elvis stopped this stuff.
Elvis was here,
and it was like about 3:00 in the morning. What entertainer would get out of a car and run into a gas station and stop a fight?
He was one of a kind, Sally, wasn't he?
He was, and he knew his presence had power like that it could diffuse a situation like that, but he also never abused that power. He never spoke of politics, and when he was questioned during that Madison Square Garden press conference, how do you feel about Vietnam? How do you feel about this? And he said, I'm just an entertainer. I would rather not weigh in on that. I'm here to entertain. And I like that, and I value that. But he also did that because Elvis knew the power and the influence that he had. He knew that if he told everybody to vote for Nixon, they'd vote for Nixon because Elvis said so, and he didn't want people to vote for that reason. He knew the power he had. He showed great wisdom and great restraint in that. And I think that's remarkable too for a man who had so much fame and power, and he didn't use it or abuse it in that way.
Where did the saying "Elvis has left the building" come from?
Yeah, it just started to be announced at the end of the shows, I think probably to calm the crowd, and he did have to leave quick. It was
So they're up screaming and yelling and screaming, and the announcer comes on, Elvis has left the building.
He's gone, so calm down. I think that was probably the hope.
He's not coming back.
And Elvis got out quick. He had to make a quick escape every time.
Roberta in Tucson, Arizona. Let's squeeze you in. Roberta, go ahead.
Okay. The most touching movie I ever saw said it was a true story, and it showed Elvis's big, compassionate heart. It took place in a home for severely disabled children. There was a girl who never had a visitor, so her caregiver took her to see an Elvis movie on visiting day. She fell in love with Elvis and wrote him a long letter, and the caregiver found his address and mailed it, and 2 weeks later, the little girl got a letter from Elvis,
and
he gave her his private address so he would get her letters right away and respond right away. And after a number of months, he asked her what she wanted for Christmas, and she said a pink elephant. And he had a great big stuffed pink elephant made for her to be delivered on Christmas Eve, and she fell asleep with that elephant in her arms.
Oh, sweet. Sally, will there ever be another Elvis?
I don't think so. But, Elvis has long been misconstrued as a glutton. For whatever reason, that myth has followed him, and that story just shows you that he gave away much more than he ever indulged in. And, cars, jewelry, pink elephants. He cared so much about people, and he gave so much away.
So truly, Elvis has left the building, hasn't he?
He has, but there's so much for us to enjoy, the movies, the music, the man, the books, the new research, just still trying to find a way to understand him, to understand his lifestyle choices, to, and again, to promote him and elevate him to historical figure. He is not just a rock and roll star. He culturally shifted the universe.
Sally, keep in touch. I loved having you on as a guest. You did a great job.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Sally Hodel, what a great book.